Good afternoon and welcome to the LSE South Asia Centre. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar and I'm Deputy Director here at the Centre. I'm delighted to welcome all of you this afternoon to the last event in this term, in Michaelmas term, which we are sure is going to be a very interesting one. And I'm going to speak a bit about how we came to plan this event because it has its own interesting trajectory. But before that, could I just welcome all members of the audience? The event this afternoon is called Afghanistan, Back to the Future. We actually planned it about 4 months ago, and more than 4 months ago, maybe 5 months ago. And it is meant in brief to look at the impact of the changes in Afghanistan on neighboring countries in South Asia, as also to look at it from the perspective of the United States. But I will speak a bit more about it in due course. Before that, warm welcome to our audience. I know some of you have been waiting. I could see on the YouTube channel that some of you were waiting. So thank you very much for your patience. Thank you also for your interest. I've received a lot of emails asking about this event, and there has been a lot of interest in it. So we're really looking forward to the discussion this afternoon. This event is, as you know, being conducted via Zoom and is being live streamed free on YouTube. You will notice that the chat function is enabled on YouTube. So if you would like to ask a question, please do ask a question via that chat function. If you'd like to tag us, then we are at SAsia LSC. If you'd like to tag individual speakers, you'll find their Twitter handles in the details section of the event on the YouTube page. And you are free to ask a question to an individual member of the panel. You're also very welcome to pose a question to the entire panel. We very much welcome that. Now, had this event been happening on site in earlier times, and I hope in later times as well, members of the audience at LSE have the right to ask a question at a public event without revealing their identity. And in keeping with that spirit, when I ask questions to the panel members, I will not be announcing your names. I'm aware, of course, that your names will be visible on YouTube, but we'll at least be able to remain close to the spirit of our on-site rules. Before I introduce the audience, I do want to say a few words about how we actually came to organize this event. And the we over here is because this event is being held in collaboration with LSE Ideas. And we have one of the directors of LSE Ideas, Professor Christopher Coker, with us. And LSE Ideas is, of course, LSE's foreign policy think tank. And this event is part of our Geopolitics Beyond Borders series. It's the 4th event. It's the first in this academic year, but we did 3 last year. And you can find all the details of those on our website. Now, when I first approached Christopher with the idea of doing an event on Afghanistan, we were looking at US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the transition of Afghanistan after the US withdrawal to an electoral democracy that, howsoever feeble, would work with President Ashraf Ghani. And it would be very interesting to explore how neighboring nations in South Asia were to then build their relations with Afghanistan in a new fashioned way without the presence of the US. We all know what has happened since. And we all know how, not only how dramatically, but also how quickly the whole situation unraveled and literally collapsed. And the Taliban took complete control on the 15th of August this year, when Ashraf Ghani left the country. I mention this because around this time, I had a conversation or an email exchange with Christopher in which he had said that his opinion was that it was actually going to unravel more quickly than I had thought it was going to unravel. And now I am no expert. So I'm very, very happy to say that Christopher was absolutely right. And so in retrospect, this has become a very curious event for me because I have had to move in my mind from having this event about South Asian nations building relations through foreign policy and other considerations, through more direct engagement with an elected government in Afghanistan, to how are South Asian nations now going to navigate their relationship with Afghanistan in the current scenario? And what is the impact of the Taliban's complete control over Afghanistan on its neighboring nations? It's important for very many reasons, and it has been very much in the news. Most importantly, and I'm sure Uday Bhaskar will mention it, is that very recently, I think it was last week or maybe 10 days ago, that the Indian Ocean Conference in Abu Dhabi, where the Foreign Secretary of India for the first time mentioned that there was an impact of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan on India. And just this week, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, the House of Commons over here, chaired by Tom Tugendhat, who had himself as an army officer served in Afghanistan, had an extended discussion with the head of FCDO, with the then Ambassador of Britain to Afghanistan, and the Prime Minister's advisor on what had happened in the context of the US withdrawal with the UK withdrawal. So the discussion this afternoon now is going to be more about how the Taliban's takeover is going to impact and how the neighboring nations in South Asia are going to engage with it, when on the one hand, there is no official recognition of that government. On the other hand, for all practical purposes, they're here to stay. I want to thank LSE Ideas for their continuing collaboration. I also want to extend the apologies of Dr. Malejacq from Radboud University in Nijmegen. He is unfortunately unable to participate today because he has come down with COVID, and he sends his apologies to the fellow panelists as well as to members of the audience. We hope to have him back at a later point. He has this very, very interesting book called Warlord Survival, The Delusion of State Building in Afghanistan, which was published last year, and I'm sure that will also make for very interesting discussion. It's now my very pleasant duty to introduce the speakers. The order in which I introduce them is the order in which they will speak. Each speaker has been requested to make opening remarks for about 6 to 8 minutes, after which Christopher will take over. He will make his own opening remarks and then start a discussion. Once again, you're very welcome to ask questions. I will come in at irregular intervals with questions to pose to members of the panel. So without further ado, our first speaker will be Dr. Antonio Giustozzi, who is visiting professor at King's College London, is fellow at RUSI, and is the author of several books on the Taliban, on Afghanistan, but most recently, The Taliban at War 2001 to 2018, which was published in 2019, and around which I'm sure Antonio remembers, we had a very, very interesting on-site event at the LSE South Asia Center just around the time that the book was published. So I'm delighted to welcome Antonio back to our center and to our event. Dr. Aisha Siddiqa is currently senior fellow at King's College London, is an expert on security studies in Pakistan, and is the author, of course, most famously of Military Inc. Inside Pakistan's Military Economy, which was published in 2007. C. Uday Bhaskar is Director of Society for Policy Studies in New Delhi, is an expert on geo-security, publishes extensively on the subject in the context of India. Michael Kugelman is Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center at Washington, DC, and is a commentator on US strategy in South Asia. And last but definitely not the least, Christopher Coker is Professor and Director of LSE Ideas and an expert on war, US security and terrorism, and the author most recently of Why War, which was published earlier this year. So I'll now invite Antonio to make his introductory comments. I will come in before each speaker to reintroduce them, and we will take it from there. So Antonio, please speak now. You have between 6 and 8 minutes.
Thank you very much. So because I'm the first speaker, I suppose I need to talk a little bit about the background that leads to the current regional political environment. I think it's obvious that the victory of the Taliban was a surprise to to many, not the victory itself, but the speed of the victory. The Taliban themselves didn't expect things to happen that quickly. And one of the consequences of that is that for the Taliban to consolidate their hold, their emirate, is certainly particularly difficult. They are not in the situation they are expected to be. In particular, the Kandahari leadership is not where he had planned to be at this point. So they had imagined a different setup. In particular, they thought that they've been able to marginalize the internal rivals, in particular the Haqqani network, which didn't happen. Because the Haqqanis control Kabul, they have essentially veto power on many aspects of policy making in Kabul. And at the end of the day, the leadership dramatically, also because there are not many other options apart from an intra-Taliban civil war, decided to accommodate them, also thanks to Pakistani mediation. So that means that many things that could have happened will not happen. The Americans will not release the money. The Americans will not recognize the emirate for the foreseeable future. That definitely weakens the hands of the pragmatists within the emirate. In particular, Barada has certainly lost influence compared to the early days after the fall of Kabul. His policy line, which is engagement with the West and willingness to make some compromises to that end, is now weaker. Essentially, it's not very credible anymore because everybody understands that whatever the Taliban do, in all likelihood, the Americans will not release the funds to the central bank, one, and two, will not recognize the emirate for a long time. Therefore, making sacrifices now for something that could happen 5 years down the line is seen by many Taliban leaders as not worth the effort. Also because anything they do will be highly controversial internally and intensify the power struggles in Kabul. So the other main policy line in this debate, in the Taliban, you have a variety of groups and factions. Most of them are focused on their own local interest, like in the Southwest, smuggling, drugs, the money that comes from that. In the Northeast, relations with the Central Asian jihadists, the control over certain mining operations, and so on and so forth. There are, I would say, two main groups within the Taliban who propose policies that are relevant to the emirate as a whole. One I mentioned, Barada and the pragmatists around him, and the other are the Haqqanis. The Haqqanis, although they're widely seen as extremists, in fact, they've tried to moderate the image, to improve the image and moderate their stand. And what they argue resonates well beyond the Haqqani network itself. And basically what they're saying is that surely some compromises have to be made. What became clear in the first couple of months of the Taliban in power is that Afghanistan is not in a position, to go for isolationism. It's not post-revolutionary Russia. The Russians, whether that was good or not, I don't know, but they could afford to be cut off from the rest of the world largely. Afghanistan cannot. As a landlocked country, totally dependent on the neighbors and also dependent on external aid, or at least remittances from Afghans abroad. So that now, I think, is clear to everybody. Among the Taliban leaders, some have doubts about how things would go early on, but now, there's no question about it. So even the Haqqanis are not arguing for isolationism, and I think there you can start seeing divergence between the Haqqanis and the real hardliners, who are essentially Al-Qaeda and allies. I think the Haqqanis agree that certain compromises have to be made, but they argue, let's keep these compromises at the regional level. It's not realistic to expect anything from the Americans. Of course, self-interest is at play here because the Americans demand the expulsion of the Haqqanis from the government. But they have a point in that, it's not, probably worth for the Emirate as a whole to invest a lot in relation with the West, and especially with America, when the returns are so uncertain and so distant in time. And then instead, establishing a reasonable working relation with the neighbors, especially the countries that share borders with Afghanistan, is a more realistic approach. We have to keep in mind that ideologically, for, if you like, jihadists, like the Afghanis are seen by many as being, and of course, Al-Qaeda, Central Asians, and people linked to them, China, Russia are no better than the United States. They're not like, not only they're not friends, but they are, if America is a devil, these are two other devils. There's no qualitative difference between the Chinese and the Russians and the Americans. So by arguing, as they argue, that it's necessary to have an understanding with China and Russia, that it cannot be avoided, they actually, they don't argue that openly, but essentially they don't object to this anymore. They don't veto this kind of relationship anymore. They basically go quite a long way, and that sets them on a divergent path from Al-Qaeda and the Qaedis and the sympathizers. And you can see signs of this already on social media, where Qaeda started criticizing quite openly the Emirate for its relations with Russia and China. So I think that's an important development. Of course, everybody has heard of, as there here is a video about the United Nations, which came just after the Taliban agreed. Apparently, there was a consensus within the Taliban cabinet, agreed to allow the United Nations agencies to pay teachers instead of the money being routed through the Ministry of Education. So these are all important developments, and I think it's still a long way before this region dimension is fully consolidated. But I think my final point, because I'm already about to end my 8 minutes, my final point is that from the point of view of the Taliban, probably the understanding of, if you like, international legitimacy is a bit unsophisticated, but basically, they're not stupid. I mean, they understand that the first layer of legitimacy is staying power. The Taliban may not have a lot of things, but definitely they have staying power. They demonstrated that. And I think the argument is maybe it will take a while before the entire region essentially accepts that we are here to stay and as constructive engaging with us. But, that's the direction to go. And, little by little, we're going to get there. So I think I ran out of time, so I will stop here. Thank you.
You do have a minute if there's something you just want to squeeze in.
I think, of course, the other point I was going to make is that the different understandings of what, legitimacy is. And of course, the stress, I remember speaking to American officials, that stress that international legitimacy, that is, being seen as legitimate by the Americans, first of all, is the number one condition for a state to be legitimate. But of course, the perspective of the Taliban is different. They don't think they need to be legitimate in the eyes of America. I think realistically, they say we need to have some interaction with some states. Doesn't mean that we need all of them. And the price to pay is, that we need to have internal divisions, split. That's not worth paying. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Antonio. I'm going to invite Dr. Aisha Siddiqa now, who is Senior Fellow at King's College London. She's an expert on security studies in Pakistan and is the author of Military Inc. Inside Pakistan's Military Economy, which was published in 2007. Aisha, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Nilanjan. Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. And really, Antonio has set the scene of what I'm going to speak about. Really, is that how does one look at current Afghanistan and look at the Afghanistan problem? Does one take a security lens, purely security lens, or take another lens, which is looking at looking at Afghanistan from a humanitarian, from a human rights and humanitarian issue. And the fact of the matter is that we are looking at a crisis. I mean, we cannot ignore, and the two are connected and disconnected. I mean, we can disconnect them and say, we are going to look at Afghanistan purely from a security perspective and look at the varied interest. And right now, the regional interests, the regional players, be it Pakistan, Iran, India, the Central Asian republics, Russia and China, they're all looking at the competing, and United States, of course. They have competing interests and different perspectives, and which kind of pulls at while they pull at each other's interests, while they've separate ways to look at at the region. But that also means that how do they deal with the Taliban? Different perspective. And that bites into the big issue of how do you deal with the people in Afghanistan. I mean, right now, people need help. We are looking at a major crisis. A major crisis is building up. So how do you deal with it? If you look at regional states, I mean, Pakistan and India, and Pakistan looks at Afghanistan primarily as a state where it wants to establish its interests. It sees it as a source of doing trade with Central Asia, of being a dominant player, and which means that it sees very little role for India, and that's where the friction is. So and then there is Iran, of course, which is very not exactly excited by, although Iran has dealt with the Taliban. Iran has established relations with the Taliban. It has accommodated Taliban. Taliban have gone and lived in Iran. There are those interests as well, and the same goes for Pakistan. And so as far as Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan is very accommodative of the Taliban. I mean, despite that, we can argue that there is the problem. It has problem with the TTP, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. Yet the fact of the matter is that because of TTP, it's not going to break relations with the Taliban, with the Afghan Taliban. It uses the Afghan Taliban to, and it insists on using Afghan Taliban to talk to the TTP. But even if TTP and Pakistan do not accommodate, and my argument is that TTP in itself is an issue for Pakistan, but it's not the kind of issue on which Pakistan is going to break its relations. It sees itself as playing that a major role, it sees that so Pakistan's main interest here is that it wants the international community, and when I say international community, definitely United States, to recognize that Pakistan has a primary role to play. That is what that is what it wants recognized. I think we are looking at what we're watching here, and what we're looking at is a conflict, a major conflict, which will be, we are looking at back to square one, back to zero-sum game. Unless Pakistan and India decide to accommodate each other's interests. Right now, it's a very narrow lens through which we're looking at Pakistani military looks at the situation as a zero-sum game. They have to stop, India and Pakistan have to stop playing a zero-sum game. The fact of the matter is that Taliban are a reality. We're looking at a failed state here. That's how the situation is evolving. Unless the two countries, major neighbors in South Asia, accommodate each other's interest. Pakistan military has to realize and understand that it cannot hold Afghanistan on its own, cannot deal with Afghanistan on its own. It has to accommodate those regional interests and it cannot do trade with Central Asia through Afghanistan alone. It has to accommodate Indian interests as well. But are we going to see that maturity and sensibility? Unfortunately not. So what we're looking at is in Afghanistan, a neighborhood which is going to be there's going to be a dominance of the reality that we have to deal with is dominance of right-wing interests.
Aisha, you've muted yourself.
So what we're looking at is a region with right-wing interest, religious right-wing is expanding. That's a reality of South Asia, and Afghanistan is going to be no different. Yet, how do you accommodate? So I don't find it odd that the Taliban in Afghanistan, they are a reality. The other Northern Alliance are not going to be any different from the Taliban. The point is, how do you accommodate these interests, and how do you develop this maturity, in the region to talk? And sadly, I don't see that happening. So what you have then is conflict. Sure. Conflict will be the future of the region, and definitely Afghanistan.
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm going to invite Uday now to speak, but before that, Aisha, you did mention towards the initial part of your comments that we're actually seeing in front of us a major crisis that is going to unfold. That crisis that you were referring to is the humanitarian crisis that is going to unfold, or was it the geostrategic crisis that you then spoke about?
I think it's both. It's both, because humanitarian is essential. But there is a geostrategic, and they're both linked, and they will both happen at the same time.
Of course, and we're all very aware of the scale of the humanitarian crisis that awaits literally in a few weeks' time ahead of us. But thank you very much for that. May I now introduce Commodore C. Uday Bhaskar, who is Director of the Society for Policy Studies in New Delhi, in India. He's one of India's leading experts on geosecurity and strategic affairs. Uday publishes extensively on the subject, has several books, and we had invited Uday to speak about India. Uday, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Nilanjan. And a minor administrative request. When I hit minute 7, if you could just give me a signal, that would help me to wrap up. Again, let me repeat my thanks to LSE for extending this invitation, and greetings to all my fellow panelists, as also to the audience, which I gather is there on YouTube. And I particularly want to acknowledge the audience that is with us today as part of this discussion on Afghanistan, primarily because I notice with a lot of regret that, barring the professionals and those who study or watch the region, Afghanistan and the tragedy that is unfolding there has largely fallen off the global radar for a variety of reasons. And I think it's very valuable for LSE to have convened this kind of a discussion, in that we have a small cluster of people who are keeping track of what is happening. And we're reminding the world and the powers that be about what is happening in Afghanistan and what could possibly be done to mitigate what my previous panelists have already described in detail about the nature of the humanitarian tragedy that is unfolding. And when we look at tragedy and its impact on human security in Afghanistan, I think there is a sense of déjà vu. And the title that has been chosen for this particular discussion is very apt. Back to the future. What is the future? And my central concern really is about the impact on human security in its most inclusive manner. Nilanjan had encouraged me to look at 2 issues, and they were framed in the following manner. What does India do now? And the second was the impact on India. I thought I'd use those as the trigger pulse to extend my own opening remarks and make the following points, which, time permitting, we could discuss in the Q&A, which is, if you look at what has happened now in Afghanistan after the Taliban has taken over power, I think India has been progressively marginalized. It is no longer visible in Afghanistan. We do not have a diplomatic presence. And given the kind of orientation, the kind of position that the Indian government has taken about the Taliban and its own DNA, you can see that there is not much contact at any tangible level as far as Taliban led Afghanistan, Taliban ruled Afghanistan, and the government in Delhi are concerned. But as regards what is it that India can do now? What are India's priorities? What are India's concerns? As far as concerns are, shall we say, placed on the table, I think this has been said in the past, it's been said again. India has an abiding interest in the well-being and welfare of the Afghan people. This is an old traditional relationship. It precedes whatever we are discussing now in the modern period. And to that extent, I think the current tragedy, which is very real to a lot of people in India, given the links that we have with Afghanistan, the immediate concern, I would say, is how do we avert, how do we mitigate the human tragedy? And we can see that in as much as there is this intense human concern for humanitarian aid, it's running into the wall of geopolitics, what Aisha has already identified and given us some detail about the manner in which Pakistan, given its own compulsions, is not in a position, not willing to allow Indian food, medicines to reach those who need it very urgently in Afghanistan. I'm sure this audience, both on YouTube and the panelists, are more than aware of the subtext of the politics within Pakistan, which for the last 6 to 7 weeks has not been able to arrive at a determination. Finally, I would say reluctantly, it said that it would allow the food to go, but only in Afghan trucks. And even that, I don't think that's going to happen in a hurry. That having been said, I think in terms of India's priorities, India's concerns related to Afghanistan, these have been spelled out in the past, but most recently, when India and Russia had the joint meeting, the summit, when Mr. Putin was here in Delhi, they had issued a joint statement. And for those of you who perhaps are not aware, they had identified the areas, as also I would interpret this to say that the priorities were also listed. And these include the formation of a truly inclusive and representative government in Afghanistan. Next is the need to combat terrorism and drug trafficking. The subtext here being the anxiety about a narco state in Afghanistan led by the Taliban and the implications for the whole region. I'll come back to that, time permitting, about the Russian concern on this issue. And providing immediate humanitarian assistance, as also ensuring that the rights of women, children, and minorities are adequately protected. Now, this is a standard template. It's motherhood and apple pie. India is not alone in identifying these issues. But at this point in time, my own assessment is that India is not in a favorable position, because India had a certain investment, a certain relationship with pre-Taliban Afghanistan. And it had also invested a fair amount of money in terms of the development effort as far as Afghanistan is concerned. And this was over a period of 2 decades, literally from 2001, 9/11, and what followed till about the middle of 2021. And there was, I would say, a tangible fallout in terms of the fruits of this development effort. And this has been stated many times in other fora by Afghan citizens themselves of different demography. I've had occasion to interact with Afghanistan in a track two manner for almost 20 years plus. And this goes back to the period when Mr. Narasimha Rao was the Prime Minister in India. And this is when I was in the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. And one has seen the emergence of the Taliban post 9/11, whatever had transpired, India's own role in Afghanistan, when we had, for instance, the Northern Alliance and the way in which India had played its cards then, to more recently. And I would make the following assessment or observation, that at this point in time, the challenges that are likely to emanate from Afghanistan are not specific to India alone. And this is what I meant when I said that at the Putin summit, when Mr. Putin was here in Delhi, and we had the 2+2 for the first time, where we had the foreign minister and the defense ministers meeting at this level, that there were certain, I would say, issues that were identified, and that perhaps Russia is a good example of a country that had positioned itself in a certain manner in relation to the Taliban, but now 3 months down the road, 4 months down the road, is aware that what is emerging in Afghanistan under the Taliban, particularly the rise of the ISIS and the inability of the Taliban to deal with it, as also the factionalism and the splintering that is already visible within the Taliban, is something that is going to lead to a very complex dynamic that could become kinetic. And I think this could play out in various ways. And I think the fact that Delhi was able to convene the meeting of the National Security Advisors in November, there again, most of you around this table, around this forum are aware that the national security assessment of each of these states is that left in this current manner, ungovernable, with this looming humanitarian crisis, Taliban would be unable to deal with whatever be the fervor, the ferment that is going to emerge. And therefore, the possibility, the potential for various kinds of security challenges is only going to increase. So it is because, I would say, of this broad assessment that India is cognizant of what it has prioritized currently as far as Afghanistan is concerned. India is willing to provide whatever aid and assistance that it can under the circumstances, given the fact that it has done so in the past. Even last year, if I got my figures right, it was almost 750,000 tons of wheat that India had made available to Afghanistan. And this is the kind of aid that is critically needed. I'll stop here and make this last point saying that we are in a very, very difficult situation where the humanitarian compulsion is being trumped by, alas, cynical geopolitical considerations. Let me stop here, Nilanjan.
Thank you very much, Uday. I'm sure we will come back to a lot of this. And I say once again, something I just said after Aisha finished her initial remarks, that the humanitarian concern is something that we're all very painfully aware of. May I now introduce and request Michael Kugelman, who is Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center in Washington, DC, to make his initial remarks. Michael comments on US strategy in South Asia and has very kindly agreed to speak about that this afternoon. Michael, please speak now. You have about 8 minutes.
Well, thank you, Nilanjan, and thanks to LSE for having me. It's an honor to be on this distinguished panel. So Aisha and Uday have very eloquently discussed the Pakistan and India factors in this story. And so what I'll do is zoom out, and no pun intended there, and look at this question from a broader, more regional perspective. And I'll speak briefly about some security, diplomatic, economic, and what I would call conceptual implications for South Asia of the Taliban takeover and US withdrawal. And then I'll say a very quick word about US policy and strategy. First, in terms of security, we've already heard about the risks of terrorism in Afghanistan and what they might mean for Pakistan and for India. I think from a region-wide perspective, a South Asia region-wide perspective, the key angle to look at here is the issue of foreign fighters, the very real possibility that jihadists from countries in several areas around the region will be inspired to go to Taliban-led Afghanistan and use Afghan soil as a space to train and prepare for attacks back home. I think that there's oftentimes a tendency when we hear the term foreign fighters to think of fighters from the US and Europe that go to fight with the Islamic State in the Middle East. But any militant, any radical coming to Afghanistan from outside is a foreign fighter. Pakistan, of course, is a very prominent example given the presence of TTP and LET and JEM fighters in Afghanistan. But I think we also have to worry, for example, about Bangladesh. There is some history of Bangladeshi jihadists going to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets in the 1980s, and then they returned home and contributed to efforts to form new militant groups at home. Some jihadist websites and social media platforms in Bangladesh registered a lot of buzz and chatter after the Taliban takeover, suggesting that radicals there have been emboldened. Another country to watch is the Maldives, which is well known for having the world's highest percentage of foreign fighters per capita. Second, what are the potential diplomatic implications of recent developments in Afghanistan for South Asia? I think we'll likely see the isolation of much of the region from Afghanistan, or should I say Afghanistan's isolation from much of the region. When the Taliban was not in power for that period between the end of 2001 and August 2021, Afghanistan didn't really have substantive relations with much of the region, aside from India, of course, which had a very good relationship with the non-Taliban governments, as well as Pakistan, which had a difficult relationship with Afghanistan, but it did have one, and to a lesser extent, Sri Lanka. But beyond that, Afghanistan didn't really have robust relations with many countries in South Asia over the past 20 years. Now, with the Taliban back in power, I think it's unlikely that any South Asian state, except for Pakistan, will formally recognize the regime in Kabul. And this then spills into potential economic implications. South Asia, as I think this panel would know and the audience would know, is one of the world's most poorly connected and integrated regions, and that's because of bad infrastructure, bad political relations. These are things that have resulted in very little intra-regional trade. And with the region not engaging formally with the Taliban government in Afghanistan, for the most part, it will be all the more difficult to build up connectivity and more regional solidarity. And this means that prospects for intra-regional trade with Afghanistan will be difficult, will be slim, unless arrangements are worked out where South Asian states are willing to do some trade with the Taliban, even without recognizing the government. As I think it was mentioned before, there's plenty of things that can be done with the Taliban government, even if you're not going to formally recognize it, but that remains to be seen. Another related diplomatic and economic consequence I envisage is that we will see the intensification of an existing trend in South Asia, and that is one of increasing sub-regionalization. SARC, the South Asian main regional organization, has not been effective, especially mainly because of the India-Pakistan problem. What we've seen in recent years are efforts led by India to bring more momentum to BIMSTEC, which is an organization that comprises some South Asian states, but not all of them, not Pakistan, not Maldives. With Pakistan likely to have a good relationship with the Taliban-led government in Afghanistan, we could see Pakistan move further away from the rest of the region so that it partners more closely with Afghanistan, as well as China and Russia and the Central Asian states. And I think this could play out in terms of connectivity issues, where subject to the security situation in Afghanistan, Pakistan could well seek to intensify the development of infrastructure projects with those aforementioned countries, while India will lead ongoing efforts or look at ongoing efforts with the BIMSTEC countries to push electricity sharing arrangements and other connectivity initiatives. Finally, I spoke of conceptual implications for South Asia. What do I mean by this? Simply put, with Afghanistan likely to remain quite volatile because of terrorism threats, the terrible humanitarian crisis that we've all alluded to, the possibility of future armed resistance and civil war if the Taliban is unable to consolidate power. And I think will be very difficult for the Taliban to consolidate power. Given how volatile and difficult the situation will remain in Afghanistan, I think, will make it difficult for the broader South Asia region to focus on some of the really big policy challenges that will only get worse in the coming years, things like water scarcity, climate change, and pandemic risks as well. And this will especially, I think, be a problem for Pakistan, a neighboring state of Afghanistan, and especially vulnerable to the spillover effects of Afghanistan's instability. So this will make it harder to focus attention and conceive of what should be seen as the most pressing policy challenges in the years ahead, non-security challenges like climate change and pandemics and so on. So in terms of a quick word on the US and US policy, how does the US play into this story now? I'll be very candid. The answer is that it really doesn't play much into it at all. The Biden administration has been very transparent about the fact that in its view, it now has bigger priorities elsewhere. President Biden himself has said in a number of speeches he's made about the decision to withdraw that he decided to leave Afghanistan in part to allow the US to better focus on other bigger priorities, competition with China, climate change, and so on. So the Biden administration will not be applying all that much policy bandwidth to Afghanistan, to be perfectly frank, even with this increasingly acute humanitarian crisis. The US, the Biden administration essentially has three goals in Afghanistan right now, and it's struggling mightily to achieve any of them. One, evacuations, getting people who want to leave Afghanistan out of there. There are so many people who want to leave Afghanistan, and the US has not been able to help them. I mean, this is very clear from media reports, anecdotally, just friends and contacts I have in Afghanistan that really want to leave but can't. We also know, too, that the US has made very little headway in helping ease the humanitarian crisis. That's a whole other issue we can discuss. And third, US efforts to build an over-the-horizon counterterrorism capacity to allow it to project the ability to conduct counterterrorism activities from outside of Afghanistan, those efforts have struggled as well. The US has not, so far as we know, has not secured any basing agreements with any of Afghanistan's neighbors to house counterterrorism assets. So the US is stuck relying on existing facilities in the Middle East, which makes things very inefficient. So the US has narrowly focused goals, it's struggled to achieve them, and it's not going to be very present in the story of South Asia and Afghanistan. I do envision Washington continuing to be involved to an extent in regional diplomacy on Afghanistan, but mainly through the Troika Plus arrangement, which is, I think, viewed as one of the more influential regional groupings on Afghanistan because of its members, in addition to the US, Pakistan, China, and Russia. I also think that it will try to work with India to address concerns about Afghanistan-based terrorism. Ultimately, there's only so much that the US can do in this regard. But American security officials, particularly at the Pentagon, they often talk these days about wanting to focus on implementing all of the defense agreements signed with India in recent years, all of those foundational agreements. And if and when those agreements are successfully implemented, that could perhaps allow the US to be in a position to provide more technological capacity and weaponry to India that can better enable India to monitor terrorism threats emanating from Afghanistan. But beyond this, I'll conclude here, the US, I think, will increasingly be looking at South Asia not through an Afghanistan lens, but through a China lens, as a region where Beijing has used infrastructure and more recently pandemic assistance to build more influence. I think that is the main frame through which the US will look at the region in the coming months and years. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Before I invite Christopher, could I just say once again, for those of you watching on YouTube, you're very welcome to ask questions. I can see that one question has just come in, but please do ask questions if you'd like to individual speakers or to the entire panel as you would like. It is now my very pleasant duty to introduce Christopher Coker, who is Professor and Director of LSE Ideas, is an expert on war, on US security and terrorism, and the author of several books, but most recently Why War, which was published earlier this year. Christopher is not only collaborating along with LSE Ideas in the series of events, but has also very kindly agreed to speak on this issue from the US perspective. Christopher, please speak now. Christopher, you need to unmute yourself.
Good.
Yeah, could you start?
Yeah.
Could you start again, please?
Sorry, I think I've used up 30 seconds of my 6 minutes. I apologize for that. You asked me to look at the general geopolitical consequences of America's withdrawal from Afghanistan. I'm not going to talk about the withdrawal itself, which I believe should have come 15 years ago. and was unfortunately obstructed by the US military, who knew 15 years ago they were incapable of actually winning this campaign. The one thing that I supported Donald Trump on was wanting to get out of Afghanistan. Alas, he let himself be overruled by General Mattis and others. The manner of the withdrawal is very, very important. But if we do go back to the fact that the US lost the war in Afghanistan, we have to ask whether it will learn its lessons. And it will only learn those lessons if the US military ever admits to its responsibility and mistakes. And at the moment, we have a military which is pretty unaccountable politically. And Biden is getting all the flack for that, I think unfairly, although there's a lot that can be said about the responsibility of the Biden administration for the manner. The second thing is that America's enemies have certainly been emboldened by what actually happened. In the very first week of Afghanistan unfolding and unraveling, we had Vladimir Putin saying, "I'm becoming more and more convinced that Ukraine simply does not need Donbass." And we can see what consequences that are from the escalating crisis that may or may not lead to war between Russia and Ukraine in the next 3 to 4 weeks. China can also read its own lessons from this about US commitment to its allies, most importantly, of course, Taiwan. The third point I would make, and here I would disagree with Michael Kugelman, I just hope that we're not going to go back to the global war on terror narrative, which we've had for 20 years. I'm not worried about terrorism in Afghanistan, quite frankly, largely because I think, first of all, the Chinese have done a deal with the Taliban as far as the Uyghurs are concerned. The Chinese are now the largest investors in Afghanistan, particularly the mining industry in Afghanistan. They have their interests. They are interested in terrorism, and they certainly don't want the United States to have any excuse for coming back into the region. The Russians have done a deal on terrorists in Chechnya. And as for ISIS, as you know, its commander was shot within a few days. That was one of the first actions of Taliban. So I do not believe that terrorism is going to be a major issue. But if it is, it's an issue for the region. It's an issue for India. It's an issue for Pakistan. It's an issue for Bangladesh, as Michael Kugelman mentioned. It shouldn't be a huge issue for the United States. The third point I would make is the allies. What are the allies, the European allies? Well, they're important because, of course, they're back in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, in the Indian Ocean, with the new alignment between the United Kingdom, Australia, etc., and the possibility of joining the Quad at some point. Well, I don't know what the lessons will be, but I suspect that the Europeans will learn the lessons the French learned after the Suez in 1956, if you remember that particular expedition, which was never again to rely on the United States. The lesson the British learned was never to do anything without the permission of the United States. That's a lesson perhaps the British will still stick to under the present government. But I think that the Europeans will never again want to be part of an expeditionary force of this kind. I think that moment in history has gone. Finally, the point I want to make is that, well, two last points I want to make, is that this will continue, I think, to consolidate China's position as the major player in Central Asia. China, not Russia, by the way, whether you're looking at the Shanghai Coordination Organization, which used to be a Russian-run organization, which China is now very much, I think, the dominant party, whether you're looking at the military exercises China's conducted with Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, the security sector reform, which the Chinese have been involved in with some Central Asian states. I think what's happened in Afghanistan, because China is now the dominant economic player there, assuming, of course, that its relationship with Taliban holds, I think this is a major change. And this brings me to my last point. It's a major change because the United States is no longer a Eurasian power. And this would have disappointed Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the last major strategic thinkers in the United States, who actually believed, rightly or wrongly, following, of course, the views of people like Halford Mackinder at the beginning of the 20th century, that Eurasia was the central pivot of power. Now, that may not be true, and it may well be, but the Indo-Pacific or the Indian Ocean, or the Asia-Pacific region as the central region. But the fact is, Brzezinski will be the first person to be immensely disappointed by the manner of what has happened in Afghanistan in the last few months. For the United States no longer to be a Eurasian power is, I think, the most important geopolitical consequence of all. What the consequences of that are, it's a little difficult at that moment to actually predict. I'll stop there, Nilanjan.
Thank you. Did anyone want to come in on what Christopher said just now? Michael, did you want to?
Yes, thank you. Very briefly, I just wanted to clarify, I actually don't think that Christopher and I are in disagreement. My point in referring to terrorism was indeed terrorism threats as they apply to Afghanistan and regionally as well, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. I completely agree with you that we need to distinguish between domestic and regional terrorism threats, which are very clear and present, those are very strong, and more transnational terrorism threats in terms of what could impact Europe and certainly the United States. I am one of the analysts that keeps saying, whenever I hear a US official say, oh, in 6 months or 12 months, you're going to have a capacity in Afghanistan to plan an attack on the United States, I keep reacting by saying, well, what do we need to see? What would need to change on the ground? Because at this point, Islamic State Khorasan does not appear at all to have that type of capacity. It's very locally focused on Afghanistan and the region. And I think that the US may find that it's, the US is trying to develop this over the horizon capacity to preemptively make it difficult for there to eventually be that type of capacity to have a threat of terrorism that could be projected far beyond Afghanistan. But as we discussed, it's going to be very difficult for that over the horizon capacity to work. The fact that the US had lost 13 service personnel back on August 26th, I think that politically made it important for the US government to speak very emphatically about the need to continue to focus on terrorism threats. But I do agree with you that the terrorism threats are mainly localized and regional, not global, not in ways that they had been many years ago.
Thanks. Christopher, do you just want to respond to what?
No, I'm absolutely also, it's always difficult when you have participants agreeing to agree, as opposing to agree to disagree. My one concern was in the immediate weeks after the final withdrawal, you did have people in Washington saying, well, we'll be back. And we'll be back in less than 5 years' time to deal with the major terrorism threat. And they were crafting that within still the narrative of the war on terror, the narrative of 9/11, as Michael just said now, the narrative of attacks on the United States. I just don't think that's a credible threat. I don't think neither the United States nor Russia would ever be interested in that development at the moment, despite their bad relations with the United States. It's a terrorism, I think, is, as Michael said, is very much a regional problem. And it's regional actors now that will have to deal with those challenges.
Great. I'm going to ask Aisha to come in for sure on this. And then could I just, Uday, would you like to say something on the terrorism issue? We have some questions, but if we can, if you wanted to say Uday after Aisha, and then Antonio, if you had something to say. Aisha, please speak now.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that, yes, we're not going to see a terrorism problem that one saw before 9/11. I mean, I think the whole the way that the table has been set, it is to ensure that another 9/11 doesn't happen. But I think let's not look at the impact that the presence of Taliban and their strengthening, and they are a reality. That's a fact. I mean, we can't wish them away, but there's going to have to be an impact of one, constant Taliban presence, but also the humanitarian crises. Let's not forget that if help does not arrive, and I don't think that help will arrive, international community is going to take the time, but the impact it will have on Pakistan's domestic politics, it's definitely going to strengthen the religious right in Pakistan. Pakistan, I mean, my concern is right now is that Pakistan, is beginning to kind of look like Afghanistan. I mean, the strengthening of religious right is happening very rapidly, and the chaos within the society is also happening very rapidly. Pakistan is not kind of looking, is seeming to be that, a capable, mature society, and when you compare Afghanistan and Pakistan, you see that one is beginning to look like the other. And my concern here is that, very soon you will see different religious groups, even extremist groups, setting up camps, claiming to provide, to collect aid, and claiming to collect assistance and help their, the Taliban. So there is going to be an impact. And then, what does it mean for violence within Pakistan? So even if it's contained, how far would it be possible to contain the violence and extremism in the region?
Thank you. Uday, Christopher made quite a few points about Chechens, Russia and the Chechens, and China and the Uyghurs, and you mentioned Mr. Putin's visit to India recently. So
I'd like to pick up two of the observations made by panelists before me. One relates to, as I see it, a certain pattern that could unfold and which would be detrimental as far as India is concerned, which is that the other major powers now engaged either directly with Afghanistan or by proxy have the equivalent of separate deals. The United States, for instance, would be comfortable, maybe that's the wrong word, but could live with a Taliban-ruled Afghanistan, which does not directly attack the United States or its assets or its interests, including its citizens. I'm paraphrasing, but that is a deal, or that is the kind of arrangement that perhaps the current Biden administration could live with. Similarly, when it comes to China, it is possible that China has already arrived at some kind of a deal or a modus vivendi with the Taliban about not attacking Chinese assets, not attacking Chinese citizens, and ensuring that even the whiff of any group that wants to take the path of terror fueled by religious fervor and ideology from the Xinjiang region, the Uyghur demography, as long as that is suppressed or not allowed to move out between Pakistan and Afghanistan ruled by the Taliban, that China would be able to live with the current dispensation. Russia earlier seemed to be of the view, and I'm saying this based on conversations and what I had seen in the Russian media, social media, and journals, that having gone through their own experience during the Cold War, they felt they had a better understanding of what is happening within Afghanistan, the local dynamic, and that if the Taliban could assure them that there would be no export of terror, either to the Stans, the Central Asian republics, or directly any Russian interest, that they would not be uncomfortable with the dispensation. This is what I meant earlier when I spoke about the nature of the geopolitics and the undercurrent of cynical deals being struck. But as an analyst, someone who's looking at human security issues, I am making the case that this would be an undesirable kind of deal. Yes, India could be directly affected, largely because of the India-Pakistan bilateral. We know its tragic history. India has gone through its own experience of terrorism, 26/11, Mumbai. India has in the past had terror groups, attacks, which were either nurtured directly or spawned in the larger ecosystem of Afghanistan. You just have to remember Prime Minister Vajpayee and the ignominy of December 1999, when Mr. Jaswant Singh, as the foreign minister, had to escort a group of terrorists into Afghanistan, received by the Taliban, and whatever followed after that. We had the attack on the Indian parliament. So India has, I think, a very clear sense of what can happen when Afghanistan is oriented in a certain way and certain forces, certain groups, certain, I would say, ideologies are supported. My larger sort of extended point is that today when we are looking at the region over the next short term, the next year or two, and Afghanistan that is increasingly unstable domestically and is pushed to the brink. Aisha has already made this point about what could happen over there in terms of the different groups and the different factions. The sense that this could be contained because of deals, I think may not be valid. It has the potential. It's a bit like the COVID virus. The kind of certitude that you could insulate your citizens and your public because you have better infrastructure or better capacity has not proved to be right. So I'm afraid all boats may leak together. And in relation to terrorism, I don't want to belabor this point that whether it was New Zealand or Sri Lanka, there is a certain non-linear pattern. Now you can come to a different kind of conclusion and say that actually it doesn't matter, we can live with the odd terror attack as long as core national interests are not affected. Now that takes us, I think, into a completely different path of public policy. And what do we do when we see a problem that is likely to become more complex, more urgent than what it is now? So therefore, I would like to introduce these caveats when we think that terrorism and whatever may emanate from Afghanistan could be contained to the equivalent of local / domestic / regional. Let me stop here. Maybe we can have a longer chat if time permits. Nilanjan?
Thank you very much. We have a few questions coming in that I'm going to pose, but before that, I'm going to give Antonio a chance to speak on this.
I'll be brief. I agree, Afghanistan, whether you're looking at Al-Qaeda presence there or the Islamic State, they either don't have the capacity or they are, there are other priorities rather than trying to organize attacks far away from there. But I think the biggest difference compared to 2001 is that in the meanwhile, terrorist networks have emerged and consolidated in quite a lot of other places around the globe. So think of situation in West Africa, think of Syria, where there still is a presence. I think from the point of view of Europe, which is different from the American point of view, what's going on in Turkey is most worrying because Turkey has become, there's not a lot of terrorist activity there, but it's become a major financial and organizational hub and logistical hub for both Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. And of course, if you are in Turkey, Europe is very close. And if you have a Turkish passport, whether you are born Turkish or not, but many Afghans and Syrians now have Turkish passports and Uyghurs as well, then it's very easy, to get into Europe, much easier than if you have an Afghan passport or even a Pakistani passport. So I think, if any of these organizations wants to carry out attacks in Europe, if they have that intention, if they want to send people there and resources, they don't need Afghanistan, basically. It's much easier to do it from other places as well, where there are direct flows of migrants and people into Europe. So that's, I think, the main reason why I think the argument about Afghanistan being potentially a Ghani base or haven for terrorists is not relevant from the point of view of Europe or America. It is different at the regional level, but I think, of course, one of the reasons why even the Uzbeks, for example, the Uzbek government has been engaging quite positively with the Taliban is because they want to create, want to establish some kind of leverage. They want to be in a position to have, to be able to retaliate, for example, financially, economically, if something goes wrong. So for example, they are giving, credit to the Taliban in the supply of electric energy, that they need, the Taliban need, but they don't ask for payment for now. So I think that's something, they actually have adopted a softer approach than even with regard to the previous government, So I think it's like, in the Iranians, of course, had a lot of issues with the Taliban recently after the 15th of August, including quite serious border clashes recently, but they've been very mild in their reaction because I think although they're not happy, they realize that engagement is really the only viable option right now. So I think in this kind of trade-offs, the Taliban don't have a lot of interest in creating problems. I think the real concern at the regional level is if the Taliban lose control. So I think as long as the Taliban are in control, they have all the incentives to keep, the jihadis away from the borders. But what if they do lose control for whatever reason, financial reasons or whatever else? then things can get very worrying for all the neighbors. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Antonio. The questions are coming in, and I'll start asking the questions now. And could I just announce, for the benefit of everyone, that we have about 20 minutes remaining. So if you have any questions, please do send it. The first one, it's to almost all of you, please do respond. But it is directly related to, Michael, what you were saying about the current American policy of being interested in powers and regions outside of South Asia directly at the moment, and also to what Christopher was saying. The question is this, I'm going to read this out. How can the United States reduce the effectiveness coming from China or other players, as in other nation states, from empowering the Taliban? Michael, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so thank you. Great question. Yeah, I think there's been a lot of commentary ever since August 15th, suggesting that it's almost automatic that China is going to be in a position to step up its game and its influence in Afghanistan with the US leaving. And I think that's an argument that deserves some interrogation in the sense that I think China is going to actually be a lot more cautious than many people think it will be. If you look at China's performance so far over the last few months since the US withdrawal, it's made some commitments for humanitarian assistance, but not very much, nowhere near the amount that the US and the EU and a number of other countries, including Japan and Pakistan for that matter, have committed. Indeed, China, as was mentioned before, I think has been engaging with the Taliban to try to get a sense as to what the Taliban will be able to do about the ETIM threat, or TIP, whatever acronym one wants to use. But my sense is that China will be very careful, at least for the foreseeable future, and will want to get indications that that group is indeed being targeted, or not targeted, but being curbed by the Taliban. My sense is if there's one group other than Islamic State, Khorasan, that the Taliban would be willing to try to curb and say, you're not welcome here, it would be ETIM or TIP, just because it's a group that I think the threat posed by that group is wildly exaggerated by China. It doesn't do much. I'm not sure the extent to which it's helped the Taliban. So I think the Taliban would have nothing to lose by turning on that group. But getting to the question, what can the US do to reduce the likelihood that China would empower the Taliban? The first point is what I said before, that we shouldn't expect that China is going to want to be in a position to start throwing money at the Taliban and doing all kinds of things. It's going to be very cautious to see how the security situation plays out. But beyond that, this is what is when you think about the trade-offs of withdrawing from Afghanistan, certainly if things work out well, in the sense that if the Taliban is able to maintain a hold on power, if there's a modicum of a stability to allow for assurances on the part of China and Russia to actually get into Afghanistan and do more in terms of investments, that's a strategic loss for the US, and there's no way around that. The US has left. There's no one left in Afghanistan from the US, so far as we know. And to the extent that the US will continue to be engaged in Afghanistan, it's through regional diplomacy and potential counterterrorism activities. But there's not much that the US can do. And quite frankly, the US-China rivalry tends to dominate everything these days. But one could argue that the US and China, to some degrees, see eye to eye on preferred outcomes in Afghanistan in terms of wanting to see more stability, less terrorism, and so forth. So one could argue it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world if China starts to invest more in Afghanistan and participate in more activities. From a strategic lens, it's bad news for the US, but from the sake of pure interests and considerations of stability, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And you wouldn't get many people in Washington to admit to that probably, but I think that's an important point to put out there.
Christopher?
Well, I think this is a case in which the Chinese are, in a sense, somewhat exposed because they have no experience, really, of a situation like this, and almost absolutely no knowledge of Afghanistan. The people who do have a knowledge of Afghanistan, other than the United States and regional powers, are, of course, the Russians, who actually didn't do too badly in Afghanistan. They weren't chased out. They didn't lose any cities. They propped up a government for 1.5 years until the Soviet Union itself collapsed and the subsidies stopped flowing. So I believe the Russians have knowledge of Afghanistan that they can share with the Chinese. And I would be concerned if I were an American that this growing Russian-Chinese partnership, this conversation between them on a variety of issues, is something that the Afghan situation may amplify in the future. And I wouldn't decry Russian knowledge in all of this. I was talking a couple of years ago to a former assistant head of MI6, the British intelligence service, who said, one of the great problems we have with current relations with Russia is that in the Cold War, we kept talking to the Soviet Union on problems like Syria, for example, because we knew that they had an extraordinary knowledge that some of us lacked. We didn't stop talking to them on Syria. Today, we don't talk to them on Syria because we're not allowed to. And we've lost a great deal because of that. So I think with Afghanistan, I hope the United States, China, and Russia can talk about Afghanistan so that it doesn't develop into the kind of situation that I think everyone in the region in particular would regret.
Thank you. Aisha or Uday, did any one of you want to come in briefly? I do have two more questions, and the last one, which is for all of you, is a very, very complicated and ethical one. So briefly, Aisha, did you want to come in? Uday wants to come in.
Yeah. You know, this question of how do you contain China? The thing is that what is the United States offering? It has left the region. It's left Afghanistan. And it's in the region, but it's left Afghanistan. It's not offering money. So that's one thing which would keep it, the Taliban engaged with the United States. I mean, the money that Afghan government money that is stuck with multilateral aid donors. So if you release that money, there is that engagement, which then, substantially gives United States builds United States stakes. The other thing which I thought that one needs to look at is that Afghanistan is one thing. If you look at AFPAC region together, I don't think that United States is entirely left and is ready to leave. I mean, there I would disagree with Michael. I don't think that United States has yet left the region, Pakistan and Afghanistan, to the Chinese. I mean, if you look at how it's dealing with Pakistan, for instance, I mean, it's a negative engagement, not a positive engagement. I mean, in the past, United States used to give money, weapons, etc., economic and military aid. That's not coming. And that's a difficult part. But it's definitely engaging much more, what I call negative engagement. I mean, for example, two major deals that Pakistan hoped to do with China, and I'm referring to the Rikudik case. Now, Rikudik case, it's very interesting that the award which was given to Tithian Copper Company, which is $5.9 billion, not been activated as yet, but that basically stops China from engaging in Rikudik. I mean, China was interested in Rikudik. Another case refers to the contract that Pakistan was the KESC, the Karachi Electricity Supply Company. The gentleman is in London. It's the Abraj case. The gentleman is in London. He's awaiting extradition to United States. It's not. I mean, the details of the case in which it's not the time to go into the details of the case, but definitely two cases one needs to look very carefully because that's where China is being stopped from entering Pakistan in a big way in terms of investment. And if you look at CPEC itself, despite this great camaraderie, great friendship between China and Pakistan, yet CPEC relationship has gone down. So there is something else happening. There is another part of the story as well. So I don't think that United States has given up and is ready to allow China to kind of march into the region, march into Afghanistan, and march into Pakistan. But how do you turn it into a positive relationship? it's still, a negative kind of a thing. China is getting stopped at the moment.
Uday, you wanted to come in briefly,
Yeah,
please.
Nilanjan, I want to make a suggestion. If you can give me a couple of minutes, I do want to talk about Afghanistan, China, Afghanistan, US. But if you have more questions, then I'd rather wait till the end of the session and make these points.
No, why don't you go ahead and take your 2 minutes?
Well, my 2 minutes, then let me make the following broad points. One is that to extend, what Michael had just said, I think when we look at Afghanistan and the correlation with the United States and China, perhaps, and this is my reading, that China's own footprint, its abilities, its leverages, its investment, I think are being exaggerated. And concurrently, I think the United States, despite that very tacky, messy withdrawal, and the fact that its profile, its reputation, credibility had been badly dented, it still has certain effective, tangible leverages in relation to Afghanistan. And my sense of the pulse in Afghanistan is that even the Taliban, given its own, shall we say, ability to arrive at these determinations, has been sending out certain signals. I'll give you a couple of illustrations. My reading is that for all the commitment of rhetorical commitment from China as far as Taliban and the new regime is concerned, they have only put down something less than $40 million, which, given the scale of China and its own deep pockets, is a very, very modest sum. And Afghans themselves have, off the record, indicated their disappointment with China's own current orientation approach. And my reading is that Beijing is being very cautious about extending itself or making any kind of commitment in the region. And I want to also, I think, extend Aisha's point about their own internal and objective assessment about the CPEC is not very flattering or not very positive at this point in time. As far as the US is concerned, I think one of the biggest and most significant leverages they have is the unfreezing of the Afghan resources, the foreign exchange. Taliban is aware of it. They have been trying to make overtures, and they know that this is not going to be easy. But my suggestion as a takeaway, Nilanjan, for this LSE deliberation is that when we are all agreed about the nature of the humanitarian crisis, and this panel has in the last 1 hour or so said that the Troika is really the most effective forum now because it brings together the United States, Russia, China, and Pakistan. Is it possible for academics, analysts, non-state people to try and make a suggestion that if you could have a Troika plus, which would also bring, in the first instance, Iran and India on board, and find some way of engaging with the Taliban, which does not necessarily translate into any kind of political endorsement, so that you stay within the political parameters of individual states. There are anxieties, sensitivities in each capital about how to recognize or not recognize the Taliban. So without going that far, my proposition is, can we engage with the Taliban? And the we is an extended Troika plus, and see how best this humanitarian aid, food, medicines can be made available, definitely before Christmas. I mean, that would be a miracle. Nilanjan?
Thank you. That's a very good point to stop, because I'm actually going to, there is a question about Kashmir that I'm going to come to. But before that, I'm going to pose a question which is to all of you. And it's very closely connected to the point where Uday finished. And I'm going to begin with asking Antonio about this, simply because of the length of time Antonio has actually spent with the Taliban. But I also know or feel that Michael would have some things to say, particularly in response to what Aisha said. So if you can sort of compress what you have to say along with this. So the question is this. So the question has come from two different people. I'm putting it together because they're actually the obverse and reverse of the same situation. And as I said, Uday just referred to it. On the one hand, we are confronted at the moment with this unimaginable humanitarian crisis that is going to unfold, alongside, as Aisha said in her initial remarks, that the major crisis was not just the humanitarian one, but also the larger geopolitical one. But for the moment, if we stick to the humanitarian crisis, is there any chance that the existing sanctions could be removed? So this is one side of the question. The other side of the same question, which has come from another person or another group, is that the greatest risk of removing sanctions and therefore suggesting to the Taliban that there is some kind of acknowledgement of the legitimacy of their having gained power, political power and supremacy in Afghanistan, is going to, in fact, legitimize in their own eyes the rightness of their position, and therefore legitimize also all the actions that in past times one has come to identify with Taliban rule, however much they may say that they have learned from lessons from their own past and that they are now governing through different principles, etc., etc. So we have an obverse and reverse. One is the whole question of withdrawing sanctions, removing sanctions, so that people quite literally don't die of poverty. The other is the implications of this kind of an action in the minds and the psychology of the Taliban in terms of their own status, given that they're not looking to give up their current position. No one is going to challenge them. And in fact, there has been a near complete withdrawal of the other forces. Antonio, if you want to start.
Well, I don't think the sanctions are going to be removed, and actually it's more complicated than just the sanctions, because the sanction, there are no sanctions against Afghanistan, the sanctions against individuals. So the individuals, some of them are totally unpalatable to the American government. So I don't think under any circumstance Americans would remove Sarojini Kani from the blacklist. I think that's not going to happen in any case, even in the future. So I don't think that's simply going to happen. Anyway, the money that is frozen from the central bank doesn't, it's a bit controversial to what extent this is linked to the sanctions. This is, I think it's more linked to the fact that if you release that money, you implicitly recognize the Taliban, because, this is not American money. This is money that belongs to the Afghan government. Now, the problem is, with the government now, not clear, because at the same time, the Americans don't really recognize Ghani as still being the president, so they have no intention of allowing him to use that money. So it's a bit controversial. Basically, the problem is that money is released, then is like an implicit recognition of the Taliban, which the Americans have no intention of, doing. And I think, to be honest, certainly the Chinese reading, as far as I can understand, is that the Americans are trying to essentially trap the Chinese in Afghanistan. So basically, get the situation of Afghanistan to degenerate to the point where the neighbors in general, but especially the Chinese, have to intervene, spend money, and then find themselves in the same situation the Americans were in, the Afghan black hole, where you get sucked in, you end up spending more and more and more to achieve less and less and less. And that's, I think, the reason why the Chinese are so hesitant. It's not so much about Uyghurs or whatever, it's about this idea, that that's a kind of, it's a sinkhole. You don't know, you might think I'm going to spend 400 million to keep it afloat, and then next year is 800 million. And I think in a sense they have a point, because, though the Taliban are a bit of an unknown quantity in terms of governance, they're basically inheriting a system built on patronage, and they themselves have been, running the organization through patronage. And patronage is like a kind of infection. Once you start, you cannot stop it, and it tends to degenerate. You have to spend more and more just to be in the same place. So I think that would certainly, from the Chinese point of view, send the wrong signal to the Taliban that they are in the same position as Karzai or Ghani were, where they're sitting there, they are the men of the Chinese, no longer the men of the Americans, and money is coming, don't worry about raising taxes, don't worry about, making, the Chinese are not worried about human rights, but they're worried about having a functional system that can support itself so they don't have to pay for it, That's to put it, I think, quite bluntly. So I think that's not viable. I think, so the other side of the question was, the possibility of, removing the sanction, legitimizing Taliban. And I think I already answered, it would have an implicit, at least legitimizing impact, which is one of the reasons why the Americans don't want to do it. And I don't think they're going to do it. I think what was more likely to happen, I think the Taliban are actually don't have much hope that is going to happen. You know, some of them still talk about it, also because, as I mentioned, that was Baradah's policy line. So people into Baradah have to push this agenda to show that they're still politically relevant. But I think this is dead. You know, I think this option died on the 15th of August, really, and there was no way of resurrecting it. I think now, unless Baradah finds some other winning argument, is going to be marginalized. And I think increasingly, the Afghans, who are the only other alternative right now in terms of a coherent policy, are going to win the day, because basically, on the one hand, they're distancing themselves from the jihadis, although in a soft way. And I think the policy line is we need to make compromises, a bit like, you know, they say, for example, take Iran, take Pakistan, where the jihadists have relations, you know, can't do what they want, but, you know, they say, you know, the leadership of Al-Qaeda is in Pakistan and is able to stay there, is more or less safe. Of course, they can do all they want. They're not totally free, of course, you know, the same in Iran. You know, they have access to Iran, they can go to Iran, but the Iranians don't allow them to do whatever they want. That's obvious. So, for, you know, they say you can survive, you can maybe, you know, you will be able to carve out some kind of niche for yourself. And I think this is what, you know, increasingly, you know, what people are familiar with China seem to hint that there might be what the Chinese are gradually getting ready to accept. And even the Russians now are signaling about their Afghanis, for example. You know, you have this kind of press reports in Russia about the Afghanis that present them in a positive light, as if they're kind of preparing to accept the fact they're going to be there to stay. You know, they're not going to go away. So I think, you know, this kind of framework, it seems to be more realistic given the context than, you know, Baradah's line. So I think that that's what's going to happen. So I think basically the money is not going to be released. The Taliban will try to survive by scrapping together a bit here, a bit from the United Nations. The Chinese in the end will give something, but they will not be very generous. The Qataris might give a little bit, you know. They will try to raise money one way or another. Apparently, there are now reports that the Chinese have already started extracting lithium on a small scale. They bring some money to the Taliban coffers, and that creates a model, you know, a virtuous model where the Chinese give some money, but they get something in return. And I think the Chinese could afford to pay, but I think they are very afraid of this kind of patron-client dynamics, where they don't want to be the patron. They don't want to, you know, spend immense amounts of money on that.
Okay, great. Christopher, should sanctions be removed to avoid a humanitarian crisis, or does that legitimize?
Let me pass to people who know a little bit more than I do on this.
Michael?
Yeah, thank you. I think from a policy standpoint, the first question, could the sanctions be removed? I agree with what was said before. I don't think they're going to be removed. I think it's highly unlikely. U.S. officials have been projecting a very tough line. You've had some senior officials testifying on Capitol Hill just in the last few days who have made it quite clear that they're not about to change their policy on the sanctions. But there have been discussions, negotiations in recent days between senior U.S. officials and the Taliban. Of course, Zalmay Khalilzad's successor, Tom West, had been at the last meeting of the Troika Plus meeting in Pakistan, when you had senior level Taliban representation there as well. And then in Doha, there have been a series of negotiations. So something is being discussed. The question is what? I think the best that we can hope for, and this, I think, sort of relates to the recommendations that came out in the recent International Crisis Group publication on how to deal with the humanitarian crisis, is that what we can hope for and push for is that there not be a full-scale ending of the sanctions, but that there will be some type of middle ground, middle way solution in which the U.S. might be able to be convinced to release some of the sanctions, or, for example, unfreeze a small amount of that $9 or $10 billion in Afghan foreign assets that have been frozen. Commit to making that modest unfreeze of, say, $1 billion, and see how the Taliban responds. See if the Taliban responds, for example, by allowing more girls to go back to school. Now, that's a very concrete thing that you can measure. It's a lot easier to measure that than measuring what the Taliban's doing with Al-Qaeda. And certainly, I think this was mentioned before, that the US does have leverage because of the sanctions issue. It doesn't have any other leverage, for sure, but this is the one thing it still has. This is its one remaining trump card. So, instead of just saying, no, we're not going to do anything about it until the Taliban shows that it's going to respect rights, inclusivity, and all. But if the US were to, be willing to take that major step of agreeing to release partially some of the sanctions, unfreeze some of that money, see how the Taliban responds that way. It's true that certainly, obviously, if you remove all the risks, you are legitimizing the Taliban. Of course, that's one of the main risks of doing it. But I think, final point on this, we oftentimes forget there's a bigger problem here. If there were to be an ending of the sanctions, it wouldn't just be an issue of saying, okay, now we've legitimized the Taliban. What does that mean? There's also a very basic practical question of what happens after that. If the money starts flowing back into Afghanistan, do we trust the Taliban to be handling all of this money and using it to develop some type of major economic recovery plan and some type of emergency response to the humanitarian crisis? The Taliban will need help. And you don't have a significant number, as I understand it, of technocrats and economists, people that have worked in previous governments, working in this Taliban government, because it's not an inclusive government. So there would need to be a lot of other conversations taking place about what role the international community would play after the sanctions were ended or released. There would have to be a lot of on-ground activities there on the part of the international community to make sure that the Taliban is in a position to handle all of that money. So I'm not trying to say that we should not end the sanctions. I think there's very strong arguments for doing it, but I would go with what I said before. Don't necessarily need to do a 100% ending of sanctions, but maybe something a bit more modest. See how the Taliban responds, negotiate with them to see how things could go. Perhaps these are the types of issues that have been discussed in Doha between the US delegation and the Taliban delegation. Thank you.
Thank you. Aisha?
Very quickly. I think, both Pakistan and Afghanistan, Afghan Taliban are very conscious of the fact that they are still ready to play the game of nerves with the United States. It's easier said than done, to say that, United States will not give anything to Afghanistan to meet the humanitarian crisis, because what Afghan Taliban and Pakistan want then, what they push for, is more images of a humanitarian crisis. Because let's not forget, that kind of an image does put greater pressure on the United States for having created it. Because you're stopping money, that's why this humanitarian crisis is an American creation. And so, they would want to kind of sell that image of a crisis, of people going hungry and a humanitarian crisis building in Afghanistan. And I think that the possibility of not entire removal of sanctions, but at least some funding, some of the money being released to meet the crisis. And I think what United States would be doing, what European Union would be doing here is, guarantees, involvement of NGOs, involvement of somebody else to actually not hand in the money to to the Taliban, but use other channels to ensure that the Taliban don't politicize the money, not just give food and assist, and not just assist those that support them, but that gets fairly distributed within Afghanistan. My thing here is that this is how the game will be played. Just one quick point which I wanted to make, that you can have a criterion by saying that the more girls you send to school and link it with that, or more women that you include in the cabinet. But does it they can do that, and then they have been doing it. They have been including minorities in the cabinet, the women in the cabinet. But does it mean that they're going to change the system, or their pragmatism is going to really push them towards abandoning their own social political norms? I don't think that there is that tension as well, which Taliban face. I don't think they're going to abandon their norms, but what definitely they will do is try to accommodate some of it, to appear more pragmatic. I mean, that will happen, but I don't think that it should be expected.
Aisha, Professor Christopher from he's calling me now.
So yeah, I'm done. There was
Okay, great. Uday, did you want to answer in one sentence? And then I have a brief last question, and then we'll sign off because we really have gone over time. But could you explain in one sentence what you quite meant when you said that what you are suggesting is that the powers, the Troika plus, could engage with the Taliban, but not necessarily legitimize or recognize them as a legitimate government? Where do you draw the line between engagement and recognition, and the Taliban themselves feeling that they are being recognized just because of that engagement? You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. I think I was trying to really get at what has already been said by the panel and by you, Nilanjan, that number one, engagement should be considered as the starting point. The detail of that engagement should be linked to the humanitarian crisis and what could be done tangibly. And as Michael said, it's not as if all the funds that are now frozen need to be released. We could have a certain blueprint which would be predicated upon some kind of tangible development on the ground. And this is something that could be done. It has been attempted about which NGOs and what kind of assistance can be done. But to me, the starting point is a certain degree of political consensus that the US, China, Russia, Pakistan, plus India, Iran could actually sit around a table and indicate to the Taliban that there are some possibilities. And can we talk about what is the most viable way forward, which would meet the expectations and respect the political sensitivities of all the players, including what the Taliban is seeking from the international community at this point in time? Nilanjan?
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, but I'm going to ask this last question because the question actually came in quite a long time ago. But if the three of you could be very, very brief about this, Michael, if you would like to start, and then Uday, and then Aisha, and that is what, if any, in light of the things that Christopher said about China and the Uyghurs, or Russia and the Chechens, etc., what, if any, in light of what Uday said about Jaswant Singh marching terrorists into Afghanistan, what, if any, impact will the control of Afghanistan by Taliban have on the Kashmir issue?
Well, I'll be brief because I'd actually be curious to hear what Aisha and Uday have to say about this one. For me, what's concerning is that the Taliban, for quite some time, has emphasized that it focuses only on affairs within its own borders, on Afghan soil. That, it wouldn't acknowledge that it has ties to international terror groups, but its own activities and focus has been on Afghanistan. And yet we have heard on several occasions, I believe, since it took power, it has spoken out about Kashmir on behalf of the Kashmiri. I think that the actual phrase that's been used by one or two Taliban officials is that we will advocate for the rights of Kashmiri Muslims, something like that. That's pretty significant if you're starting to hear that from the Taliban, because I think that could go a long way toward really emboldening these Kashmir-focused groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, which, as I understand it, have had a relatively small but nonetheless extant presence in Afghanistan for sure. But I'll end there and would welcome hearing what others have to say about this.
Aisha, do you want to say anything on the Kashmir issue?
Broader, Kashmir issue, but broader Afghanistan issue as well. I think.
Aisha, if you can switch on your camera.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Very quickly, I think there is a need for engagement between India and Pakistan, very essential, even to solve Afghanistan. I think what is also important is that I think where I feel good, positive, is that so far violence remains limited in Kashmir. And Pakistan itself, military, despite how passionate it is about Kashmir, has not kind of re-engaged in that conflict. And I think more than Taliban, it's Pakistan and its military which needs to be engaged by India so that it doesn't start. And I don't think that the Taliban on their own, despite whatever they feel or whatever remarks they've made, because ultimately Pakistan's assessment is that this time the conflict in Kashmir will start only if the Kashmiris in the valley take the initiative. And that initiative so far is not coming. So unless that happens, I don't think that Taliban on their own are going to engage with the Kashmir issue. It's the Pakistan military and so far. So it's important that India and Pakistan resolve that in this kind of period that we've gotten, in which some kind of peace, an unstable peace, seems to be happening.
Uday, briefly, the Kashmir issue, will it be impacted?
Briefly, I would say that there is a certain kind of latent concern about the correlation between Taliban-ruled Afghanistan and the Kashmir issue. What Michael has said is correct, that there have been some references by some ostensibly quote-unquote factional leaders who have made this observation or this point, and that gets picked up on social media. And then it is often, shall we say, used in a certain way. But my reading as a security analyst is that at this point in time, even the Taliban wants to reassure India that they would not be acting in any manner that would impact India's core interests, and here Kashmir is right on top. So I would say that potential, yes, but I think on the ground, it is not an immediate amber light issue. Nilanjan?
Great. Thank you very much. There is one more question that I'm going to read out, but I'm afraid we don't have time to discuss this. It is from someone who'd asked an earlier question, which was that do the speakers foresee any similarities between the Taliban in Afghanistan and, for instance, North Korea, trying to play between the US and China, Russia, but unfortunately we don't have the time. Thank you very much, all our speakers, but thank you especially to our audience, our very loyal audience who sat through this, even though we've spilled over by 19 minutes. And thank you to everyone who asked questions. Thank you to a particular group who have been commenting a lot through the course of this event. We're very glad that you engage so much with these events. That is the whole purpose of it. A very special thanks to all of you. You've all held on to my invitation for the longest possible time. Uday Bhaskar, Antonio Giustozzi, Michael Kugelman, Aisha Siddiqa, and most importantly, Christopher Coker. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.